and it will feature a discussion on what could only be described as a very timely topic, namely the federal budget and other research policy issues impacting universities, of which there are virtually none these days. We have two very distinguished speakers who are known far and wide as being extremely knowledgeable about these topics. First speaker will be Toby Smith, who is the Vice President of the Association of American Universities. He is the Vice President for Policy at AAU, and he has been there for almost 15 years. He will be followed by Jennifer Poulikides, who is currently the Vice President for Congressional and Government Affairs at the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. So between the two of them, their organizations represent the vast majority of us in the room this afternoon. One thing about Jennifer that I can't fail to mention, and that is that she is a distinguished graduate of UCLA. And as another distinguished graduate of UCLA, I'm compelled to point that out at every possible opportunity. So without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Toby Smith. After both Toby and Jennifer have spoken, we'll have some time for questions and discussion. Toby.
Thank you, Dick. Well, it's great to be here at a time when when there's really not a whole lot to talk about. It has been an interesting year. I speak every year to the incoming class of AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellows, and that happened this morning. And it's always kind of like, okay, summer's over, I'm talking to the fellows again, they're here. This year it really was different though, because I remember what I was saying last year, what I was thinking in September last year, and where we are now. So I'm going to lay some context for the current environment, and then talk a little bit about the budget, and then turn things over to Jennifer. Needless to say, we have had some challenges. These challenges existed even before the election, and I want to talk a little bit about those and focus on three in particular, although not all, some of these are driven by the election. The first, the polarization and gridlock, I think it's useful to have that context and what's going on, and I'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the fiscal situation, because that leads us to kind of where we are with the budget. And then the other one that I think is what is probably most unique about the times we are in this administration is the extreme uncertainty in the fact that what you're doing one day and what you think the issue is can change the next day, perhaps because of what came across on Twitter. But it's a really different environment for us, and I think Jennifer and I and our associations have been trying to respond and react to what the crisis of the week appears to be, or what the concern of the week is, and then also reassure our universities that we know what's going on when oftentimes we don't, and things like that. So let me talk a little bit more. So first I want to talk about the normal legislative process. It's moving very slowly, but it will come out, hopefully. Well, come on. We're going to try this again. There we go. So you may have heard that Otto von Bismarck, who was a chancellor of Germany from 1871 to 1890, is credited with saying there are two things you don't want to see be made: sausage and legislation. So like when I talk to the fellows, I always say, welcome to Washington, to where the sausage is made. Then I tell them, but it doesn't really look like that. Come on. There we go. This is much more what the legislative process looks like today. In fact, it's gotten so bad around this town that a few years ago, if it will open, it's open on my computer really quick. Come on. We're going to try that again. There we go. Now it's there. A few years ago, there was a article in the New York Times that actually interviewed. Oh, come on! It reacted to what I did. I'm going to let it just open. There we go. And you can read that quickly because it just went back. There we go. It will stay now. There was an article right now in the New York Times that they went out and interviewed the sausage-making folks about how what it was like to be compared to Congress, and they really were not happy because they said we actually get things done and we make sausage, which is where this quote came from. So it was quite interesting to see, but it has gotten pretty bad around here. So I like to talk about why, and it really has to do with this graph that I like to show. This is based upon some work done by some political scientists who have essentially looked at crossover voting, the willingness of Democrats to vote with Republicans, Republicans to vote with Democrats. And what they found is if you then, based upon their formula, they found that today, even going back to just after the Civil War and Reconstruction, the Congress is more polarized than it's ever been before. There are other graphs. Norm Ornstein, who's a talking head around town, often will talk about if you were to put the members of Congress, if you were to put the members of Congress on a football field 20 years ago, and you were to say, align yourselves in the 1,000-yard field where you stand in terms of your ideology, you would have had a lot of members in between the 30s in the middle. Now, the middle is pretty empty. And both the Democrats and the liberals are, especially the Democrats are down in the 30s and below, and some of the Republicans are frankly in the red zone and beyond into the end zone. That's where we're at, and it really determines why we are having trouble getting things done. The Cook Political Report, if you follow the work of Charlie Cook, he's a really well-known pollster in this town. They have looked at swing districts, and just here recently they came out with their analysis of where we stand in terms of the swing district, which really means that it's a competitive district between the Democrat and Republican in a congressional race, and that they found that from 1996 we had 164 members that were elected from swing districts. This last presidential election we went down to 72. And what that really means is that we are more and more, partially because of gerrymandering, partially because of just geographic swings where, rural people living in rural areas are voting for conservative members, urban, suburban areas are voting for more liberal members. What it really means is we're electing more ideologues to Congress, and we're losing our moderates. And the moderates are the ones who broker the deals and get things done, and that's why we're having trouble passing legislation. I also tell the scientists in the room that for science, this makes it hard, because when you're electing people who come to Congress with their minds made up and are not willing to compromise, they already know what they believe, they're not willing necessarily to listen to facts. So keep that in mind. What's the result? Well, a continual decline in the ability to get legislation passed. If you look at the 112th Congress, the Congress being 2 years, that's 2011, 2012, they passed 284 laws. This graph comes from the Washington Post. It shows that it was that's about the lowest in history. Now, we've had a few Congresses since then. I do like, before I talk about that, I compare this to the 80th Congress. The 80th Congress was 1947 to 1948. They passed 900 public laws. That was Harry Truman's do-nothing Congress, by the way. So you see how far we have sunk. We have done better, though. We are doing better. They eked out a little bit better record in the 113th Congress and the 114th Congress. They got 329 bills. Now, where are we at right now? We passed 55 bills. That's in the first term of President Trump's administration. That's a few more than what both Barack Obama and George W. Bush before him could claim by September 1st of their first year in office. Go back to Bill Clinton, he actually did better than that, but he also had a Democratic Congress, if you remember, to work with. Although President Trump has a Republican Congress, but it hasn't been going all that well, although we'll talk about it. Maybe the ice jam there has broken in some ways with what's happening actually in real time as we speak right now on debt ceiling legislation, CR, things like that. The other thing you need to know is that it's not just Congress that's polarized. This is a slide I've added only in the last year or so, that it's really the American population is becoming more polarized. Now, so we can attribute Congress, well, they're drawing the lines, the districts and things, they're making it, that's why we have a more polarized, we don't have districts where you're going to be, where a moderate can get elected. But the public is another interesting factor, and I attribute this partially to the fact that people now they basically they're predisposed to certain ideological beliefs, but then they turn on the news and they watch either Fox or they watch MSNBC, and that reinforces their views, but it pushes them even further to one side or the other with, again, not getting any kind of balanced perspective on the world. And that then leads to something else I observe about the presidential election, which I found quite fascinating. I was always taught in political science, after the primaries, the candidates run to capture the middle. If you look at what happened with Hillary Clinton, she ran to capture all the Bernie voters, and Donald Trump was catering to the Christian right. So it's very interesting what that means for Congress and our ability to, so that's a huge challenge. The fiscal situation, well, it's pretty grim. We know that we have been running a deficit. The good news is that deficit is shrinking. Used to be, when I gave this talk, or pieces of this talk and talked about it, that was in the $1 trillion number. So we've actually cut it down. That's partially due to things like budget caps and sequestration and continued resolutions that go on and on. But the challenge with that is, and with sequestration, the fact that we have these budget caps which were instituted to try and drive a Congress that couldn't work together to get something done by proposing something so draconian they would have to come to some agreement. Well, they weren't able to, and thus we ended up with budget caps and sequestration. And that is what we've been dealing with, and partially why we're in this difficult situation. I just say, I like to mention that Norm Augustine, who of course was CEO of Lockheed Martin, and then went on to, has been a great supporter of science, and also chaired the committee that wrote Rising Above the Gathering Storm, has compared cutting science funding in a time where we need to grow the economy to essentially eliminating the engines on the 747 to meet your weight requirements. That really doesn't make sense. That we need to grow the economy, and the way to grow the economy is to invest in R&D. So we talk a lot about this thing called the innovation deficit, what we are spending on R&D and research versus what we should be spending to maintain our leadership role in the world. You see this chart that I have, which really shows that in terms of our growth and investments in R&D, they've been stagnating when you compare the US to around the world. So the fiscal situation has not been easy. Jennifer will talk a little bit more about that. We can talk about it in the context of the cuts that we have seen. And so this gets to uncertainty, is we don't really know what's going to happen on any given day. One thing that has been difficult is that a lot of key positions around this town have yet to be filled. And we're waiting, and there's only been, this is a little bit out of date, but only 117 of the 577 key positions that require Senate confirmation have actually been put in place. Very few science positions. Now, we did make some progress on this. When I gave this just a month ago in Cura, of course, we didn't have an appointment of a NASA director. We got that last week. got a second, the NOAA director still hasn't been appointed. We don't have an OSTP director. OSTP is pretty barren. There is one person that's a political appointee who's there. But beyond that, a lot of the detailees are now gone, and there's no one there. And so we wait and we see, but one of our challenges when we go to talk to people, there's no one there. And so we can't get a whole lot accomplished. In fact, I've been working on one of the areas I oversee is open science. There's an interagency working group on open science. They have a report, they have a draft report, they're ready to get it approved by OSTP. The problem is there's nobody to read it. So legislative productivity. I've mentioned 55 bills signed, but it is interesting. Many of those bills, by the way, just reverse Obama policies. They failed to pass the health care bill. There's been really up to date no major pieces of legislation. We're still waiting for those. Now, I say that, yet to do, we haven't passed a budget resolution. We just got an agreement that is very interesting. That's why I say the ice may be breaking. If you're going, and President Trump made this deal on the debt ceiling and Harvey relief, where he's willing to deal with the Democrats. That's been what has not been happening. I don't know what it means for the future. Maybe, Jennifer, you have some ideas. I'll let you speculate, but it's very interesting. Of course, we're waiting for a tax reform bill. The appropriations bills, by the way, today in real time, they're moving 8 through the House. So they're starting to move on those. And I don't think we'll end up with any kind of infrastructure package, to be honest, even though there was a lot of talk about that. So now oh yeah, we already talked about that. The budget. I'm just going to talk more about where we started with the budget, and then we'll kind of pick up later and talk about where we're at. So, of course, we had this skinny budget, which often happens when a new president comes in. It takes them longer to rejigger things and come up with their own budget. So in March, we ended up with this really narrow thing. That's the first glimmer of where we heard there might be a cap proposed on facilities administrative costs, by the way. One thing that was clear was that President Trump wanted to increase funding for defense by $54 billion. To do that, and to stay under the budget caps, you'd have to decrease domestic discretionary spending by $54 billion. Therein lies the rub. Therein lies why we have seen, and I'll go through these in just a second, significant proposed cuts to the budget. I often tell people, when you look at the cuts to facilities administrative costs, that was kind of, you were backed into that because basically the administration had to cut NIH. It's such a big piece of the domestic discretionary budget that they had to find funds, and then they had to justify it. So I think folks at OMB were told, justify these cuts because we have to meet these targets to basically stay under the budget caps. So the impact on science and the budget. Well, first of all, the cuts we expected cuts, not perhaps as steep as they were. I'm just going to run through those. Over a 20% cut to NIH. Of course, we then got a follow-on budget that was more detailed later. I think it came in April, May. And that was where we saw the real language and what was proposed for F&A. We also saw a proposal to cap salaries at NIH. NSF was cut by 11%. There was a 5.6% cut to the DOE proposed, 17% cut to Office of Science. DOE Office of Science, ARPA-E, was proposed to be eliminated. EPA was cut by a third. Office of R&D at EPA was cut in half in the budget, 16% cut to the Department of Commerce, and then you saw things like NOAA again cut in half. Programs that were more kind of the Valley of Death programs, the more applied programs. In this instance, NIST Manufacturing Extension Partnership was zeroed out. NASA was the one that got away with the least amount of cuts in terms of the president's budget, with only a 8.8% proposed reduction, and there were no increases. We thought the one place we might make some progress with a $54 billion increase was in DOE science and technology and basic research, and that didn't happen because there were, believe it or not, proposed cuts there, or at least pretty much level funding. So that then causes this fear that we're going to lose a generation of scientists, but don't worry, there's still hope. It was pretty clear when the budget was released that Congress wasn't going to go along with it. They aren't going along with it. Those bills are again, we've got a $1 to $2 billion increase likely for NIH. Other agencies like NSF, they get a little bit of a cut in what's been proposed on the Hill, but not near the 11% that was proposed. So the good news here is that it's the duty of the president to propose, it's the privilege of Congress to dispose, and that for the most part, they are favorable towards the programs we care about. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Jennifer. Let's see if I can get this off. Where do we go? Is it over there? Right there.
Thanks, Toby. I can barely see some people over here, so I should stand on the chair. Toby made so many points. I mean, we spend a lot of time together. We have a lot of similar views about what's going on in Washington right now. We've been here about the same amount of time too, which is a lot longer, certainly, than I ever thought I'd be here. Maybe you too. And I've seen a lot of unprecedented, right? So, you know, I moved here in 1993 in the Clinton administration, and we saw some things happen during the Clinton administration that were unprecedented. And that continued, right? I mean, that continued with some great things and some terrible things over the past 20 some odd years. There's nothing more unprecedented than what we are experiencing right now. You cannot make this stuff up, and the uncertainty is absolute. Nobody can say they know what's going to happen, right? I mean, in the past, we could have some of these conversations and say, well, this is the direction things are heading. This is what we think will ultimately come to be, or this is the these are the principles laid out by an administration. So this is the way things will go. No, we cannot predict. Certainly not with any accuracy. We can try to predict, but not with any accuracy. So on the upside, we're all here in Washington during a very historical time, right? It is a little bit nutty. Just talking some about and a lot of what Toby and I are talking about overlaps, but I think some of the repetition is worthy. So the budget and appropriation cycle, and I have to also credit AAAS for a lot of the graphs that I'm using. They put together some fantastic graphs and charts. So the typical budget and appropriation cycle has us currently just wrapping up FY18, right, through the congressional process, and beginning FY18 with a clean slate, new numbers and so forth on October 1st. That will absolutely not be the case. In fact, the Senate made took some action today that made it clear that is not going to be the case. In our wildest dreams, it could not be, but even because the House has moved 4 or 5 of their bills through the House. The rest of their appropriations bills are in one package, so that's 8 bills. We're calling it an octobus. The octobus is on the House floor right now. The Senate has not moved any appropriations bills, so none of the bills have been signed into law. We're not looking at any accomplishments yet for FY18. So we're in this situation where, in order to keep the government running, if that's what we want to do, and that's an uncertainty sometimes, we have to pass a continuing resolution that will allow the government to keep funding at basically current year levels, and that is what the Senate did today. They packaged up. Toby alluded, and no doubt you've seen some of the news. Just yesterday afternoon, the president had House and Senate leaders from the majority and the minority to the White House to discuss how are we going to move forward with the Harvey hurricane relief bill, increasing the debt ceiling, because, by the way, if we don't do that, by the end of September, we will not be able to pay our bills, and our country has lots of bills to pay. We have debt, so we have to at least pay that, and we've got to keep the government running. So increasing the debt ceiling is very important, and also keep the government functioning for the next fiscal year. How are we going to deal with all that? And in a deal that Democratic leaders proposed earlier yesterday, and the House Speaker from the majority side completely dismissed as foolishness. That's the deal that they shook on yesterday, because President Trump and the Democrats said, "Yeah, we'll do this," and sort of left the Republicans, the majority in Congress, in the dust. And so they came to the table and said, "All right, we'll do it." It's not a totally done deal yet. There is pushback in the House from the Republicans, particularly call them themselves the Freedom Caucus Republicans, very hardcore in their fiscal views and some social views as well, but definitely on the fiscal side, they're not interested in this deal. They think it's a raw deal for them, and so they might be able to hold it up in the House. But the Senate today passed that package, and what that package does is it will allow the federal government to keep running until December 8th. So it includes relief for Harvey, some relief for Harvey, almost $8 billion. It includes a continuing resolution to keep the government funding, because we do not have an appropriations package for FY18 through December 8th, and it increases the debt ceiling until the estimate is about December 8th, which only sets up another great potential fiscal cliff in December. So it's a nice little holiday package for Washington. So that's sort of where we are on timing for appropriations and funding, and how that is inexorably in this day wound up with lots of other issues and important issues. So this is a simple chart that no doubt you all are very aware of. Most of university R&D funding is supported by the federal government. So that's funding that federal government puts out overwhelmingly on a competitive basis. Universities, individuals at universities apply for that, compete for that funding, and that blue in the chart, dark blue, is the federal part of the research and development work that our universities do. Of note is the gray part, the university, the self-funded part, is actually growing. It's not that easy to see on this chart because of the way other parts are moving, but the university component is growing at a time, frankly, when universities are not seeing a whole lot of support. I work for the public universities. Certainly they're not seeing a lot of support from their states And so they're needing to figure that out, make that up in other ways. This pie chart, no doubt you've likely seen it before, but it's always so stark to me to look at that chart, because the colored part, the red and the blue part of that chart, that's what Congress deals with in the appropriations process every year. So that part, which is a little bit more than a third, a little bit more than a quarter, a little bit less than a third, that's the part that we're wrangling over every year during appropriation season. And that part keeps shrinking as the gray part of the budget, which is what we don't have to deal with or what Congress doesn't have to deal with on an annual basis, continues to grow. That's the mandatory part of the budget. That's what's sort of set in stone and is, I wouldn't say in stone, but sometimes it feels like that. It's the part of the budget that's on autopilot, and that autopilot allows that part of the budget to keep growing. As we continue to borrow more money to keep our government funded, keep the country running, the part that we pay on interest grows. Of course, big chunks of this are Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And Congress has, and it's not just Congress, it's the administration as well, and it's Democrats and Republicans. They have a really hard time dealing with that part of the budget. Part of it is because of very effective advocacy efforts. Effective, but I would also say in many ways irresponsible to our nation's future. Irresponsible advocacy efforts by some who would say, do not touch Social Security, do not touch Medicare. Those parts of the budget are sacred, and so what if they keep growing? Something to keep in mind is that those parts of the budget do not help grow our economy. They are not investments. They are not future-looking, except that they will gobble up all the budget if we continue along this path. So the gray part of the budget is of great concern to us. Of course, this is the spending breakdown. What we also don't see in this chart is the inputs, and the inputs part is the tax part of the budget. Where does the federal government get its revenue? A huge part, of course, is on the tax side, and something that both AAU and APLU have at times made a significant point over is that to save, to help ensure that the investment part of the budget, which we would argue is in the colored part, not all of it, but it is in that colored part of the budget. To save that investment part of the budget, we have to deal with reforms on the mandatory side of spending and on the tax side of revenues. And it's not a place that universities, certainly not that university leaders wearing their university badges often come out to talk about. It's not a safe space, really, but it is critically important as we look at how the colored part of the budget does continue to shrink. So let me also point out that the red side is defense spending, the blue side is non-defense spending, and you can see the parts that are extra pulled out, those are R and D. On the defense side, you should note that overwhelmingly it's D, that's the light red. Not as much R as we would like, but we continue to work on that. So Toby mentioned the Budget Control Act, and he talked about sequestration. I'll just go over this a little bit because I think this visual is helpful. So if you look up at the start of the solid line, that's where the conversation basically started in 2011 when Congress needed to increase the debt ceiling. The administration, so this was under President Obama, the administration wanted an increase in the debt ceiling. Congress was hesitant about increasing the debt ceiling, and I think everybody here knows what that would mean if we did not increase the debt ceiling. Can't pay our bills, we would have to shut down the government, it would absolutely be chaos. To increase the debt ceiling, Congress held as for ransom wanted a decrease in spending. So, okay, we're going to increase how much we will go into debt. We want a commensurate decrease in how much money we will spend, not just this year, but for the next 10 years. And so came up with a number. And they essentially divided that number in half and said, we're going to do half of that across the board, basically. And so you'll see, and not across the board by program or by agency, but just by year. We're going to take that. So the projection from the solid line would have continued to go up if we had stayed on sort of the budget course. That was the projected budget path. With the Budget Control Act, we went immediately down, and then Congress said, all right, that second half of savings, we're going to figure out how to do that. Oh, and that, by the way, just to be really clear, that all came out of discretionary spending. That all came out of discretionary spending. So half the cut to ensure that we could continue to operate as a country. Half the cut came out of discretionary spending. The other half was left up to a group called the Super Committee. The Super Committee was comprised of Democrats and Republicans from the House and the Senate come together, and these are good, smart people who had a lot of respect in their parties, in their chambers. Come together. Let's figure out how we deal with the other part. Can we possibly make some reforms in taxes? Can we possibly make some reforms on the mandatory side? Can we make some decisions in our discretionary funding about where we want to cut? The Super Committee ended up not being so super after all, and they did not come up with a plan. And so according to the Budget Control Act, that meant we dropped down to the next dotted line, automatic cuts, again, all to the discretionary part of the budget. So that's where we ended up, basically, after some negotiations that didn't get us anywhere in 2011. It did allow us to borrow more money, so our country kept functioning, but it didn't take care of our big systematic budget issues. Now what this shows is that because that second dotted line is so painful, Congress really was not able to pass appropriations bills that met those cuts. It was so painful. So it did bring Congress together, and this happened twice. It brought Congress together two different times, in 2013 and in 2015, to make a deal to provide some relief. We call it sequestration relief from the deal, from where we would have had to have been under that second dotted line. Now, where we are now is no more deals, right? We just wrapped up in 2017 the second deal. And we're living it right now, the last few days of the 2017 fiscal year. After that, there's not another deal on the books. We are advocating strongly for another deal. That's the only way we're going to see relief. That's the only way we're going to ensure that the programs we all care about are not dramatically cut. So we need Congress and the administration to come to another deal. And as Toby referenced, maybe we see a path now based on the deal that was cut at the White House yesterday. Maybe that blows up any notion of deals in the future. So if we were to continue without a deal, there will be a drop. So it's a little hard to see because the solid line that moves from 17 to 18 actually takes us down, because 17 was part of the deal. So we got relief from sequestration. After 17, we dropped back down to 18. So we would be at lower levels of funding overall for this next fiscal year without a deal. The president's budget request proposed major increases for defense discretionary spending. And I'm going to go back and forth between a couple slides. This comes in the president's budget request at severe decreases in non-defense discretionary spending. So the president's budget proposal looks great on the defense discretionary side, looks really lousy on the non-defense discretionary side, and you'll recall what some of those cuts look like, proposed cuts look like for science and research. They were drastic, right? Huge cuts for NIH, for NSF, getting rid of agencies altogether, agencies like the National Endowment for Humanities, ARPA-E, and so it's pretty devastating in terms of the budget proposal. Now, one thing I need to go back to that Budget Control Act package from 2011. One thing that set up that I think was a smart move on behalf of members of Congress was they said, all right, going forward for the next 10 years, so until 2021, if we increase one side of the budget, of the discretionary budget, meaning if we increase, say, defense, we've got to increase non-defense too. So that's we call that the parity principle. Parity on both sides of the discretionary budget, which helps a lot, frankly, because at the end of the day, the budget hawks, the defense hawks could win out, but they've got to change the law to win out. In which case, they really do need folks who care about the discretionary side of the budget to join them. So Toby mentioned we're actually this is an interesting chart, again put together by colleagues at AAAS, that compares the Trump first budget to Reagan's first couple of budgets, and makes the case that we have not seen anything as drastic in terms of cuts to discretionary budget since the Reagan years. Now, Toby did make the point that the White House proposed cuts. Congress is a whole other beast, and Congress is moving along, making it very clear from the very beginning that they were not interested in going along with the administration's budget request. So we have seen much better numbers, almost universally, come out of both the House and the Senate. In some cases, one chamber's numbers are better than the other chamber's numbers. In some cases, neither number is anything to cheer about, but almost universally, it's all better than what the president proposed in his budget. So that brings us to where we are now. We've got a whole lot more than than just budgetary issues to worry about. Some of these issues listed here are very connected to budget issues, but we thought it'd be best to maybe take these on. Toby and I'll just sit back down and we can start talking about some of these issues and also field questions at the same time. And this is not by any means an exhaustive list of what we're looking at. That does seem to change almost every day, but we thought it'd be a good opportunity for more discussion. So thanks.
Before we do that, I just have one quick question for you. You said that in the proposal that the Democratic leadership put forth yesterday for a 90-day extension, a 90-day extension or raising of the debt ceiling and a 90-day continuing resolution. Why do you think they proposed what, at least to me, appears to be a very short period of time as opposed to something longer that might improve the likelihood that something good will happen? You can take out the word good. That was an editorial comment.
So there are a couple of reasons for that. I'll be super cynical and say one reason is political. Taking a vote on the debt ceiling is something that particularly the Republicans do not like to do. Democrats don't have such a big problem with it. Overall, individuals might, certainly. And so setting up a joint system so that funding for the next fiscal year is tied to raising the debt ceiling, which leadership on the Republican side, leadership recognizes is necessary to do, might have been at least a little bit of a political play.
But why only 90 days? Why not a year?
Because they get to vote again in 90 days. This is the only time the Democratic Party actually has a vote of power. And that's not the Republican to Obama's administration as well. They were holding on the line, and when it came to that date again, they bring up issues that they wanted to talk about, like immigration or something else, and put that into the argument.
The Republicans wanted 18 months. Okay, so that's the difference. And every time they have to have a debate on this, it distracts them from doing the things that they haven't been able to do relating to their agenda. So politically, the Democrats, and if you watched the news last night, people were just, Trump did what? And the Republicans, I think, were just baffled and literally cut off, in the middle of a sentence, discussion that his own people were leading about trying to get a longer deal, and said, we'll do it. So. Yeah. I will just, I know, since it's the first thing up there, and I know nobody really cares about it, we don't need to talk about facilities administrative costs. No, there's real good news on that even today. First of all, we had already had language included in the House Labor HHS appropriations bill, and the actual bill language that would become statute that prohibits any cap on NIH indirect cost payments that would deviate from how they've been paid in basically the last third quarter of the last year, which means you can't cap F&A. Similar language was included today in the bill that was marked up in the Senate. Even better news, continuing resolution that we just are talking about being forged has language that prevents a cap, which means even if we are in a waiting period, that bill has to get enacted. Will last till December 8th, prevent any cap from going into effect, so there's no way the administration can act unilaterally. We have made a lot of progress. I will say the administration did complain a little bit. They get to issue these statements of administration policy on bills, and so they did mention their unhappiness with Congress mucking around with what they feel is their business to make research more efficient, and they kind of growled a little bit about the language prohibiting the cap. But I think in talking to folks at OMB, we, at least for this year, are probably in a pretty good place and have made a lot of progress. So that's where we're at on F&A. It doesn't mean it's not going to come back. We know there's a review and a study being done by the Congressional Budget, by the Government Accountability Office on ASF, how they deal with indirect costs. We know that we have had a not so friendly op-ed in the Washington Times from the committee of from Lamar Smith, the chairman of the Science Committee in the House. So I think we will see. Indirect cost F&A is a continual battle. We have to fight it. I think we've made a lot of progress and continue to urge folks on our campuses that they need to talk to faculty. And I think one good thing is I've heard, first of all, we've seen tremendous support from the scientific societies in ways that 5 years ago we wouldn't have gotten. There was a letter that was sent. We, of course, many of you were involved in letters that were sent from your own campuses. We thank you for that. We got over 100 letters that went to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tom Price, and to the OMB director. Those have made a big difference, but those also went up to we made sure those got up to Bill too. But there was another letter that was signed by how many different scientific societies?
109.
109.
Patient groups.
Patient groups, scientific societies, organizations like FASEB. There was a time when that would have been much impossible to get that type of support. So we made a lot of progress. I'll let Jennifer. We've been on a road show together, by the way, talking about F&A. So that's what we've been talking about together most recently.
I'll stand up again, probably because it's even worse when I'm sitting. But one point I wanted to make about F&A and the advocacy efforts that we've put into F&A in this case. So you all are no doubt aware that this isn't the first time F&A has come under some kind of attack. It's been on the chopping block, or it's been in someone's crosshairs. But this time was really big. It was not just a lot of support looking to be cut, but it was in the president's budget request. And so it was out there for the whole world to see. It wasn't, a quiet amendment or a little bit of this or that in a bill. It was out there. And so we changed our advocacy approach. And whereas in the past, because F&A is pretty arcane, not to this crowd, I know, but go to Capitol Hill. Whew. I mean, it's often hard to explain, and people would not always do a good job of explaining it, and so there were places where policymakers would say, oh, well, in that case, let's do that, let's take that. We kept our advocacy in the past very targeted, very focused on the concern at hand. And we were able to manage that. This time it was, the threat was big, and so our advocacy response was also big. And so we worked with all our campuses to reach out to their members of Congress and really educate. We really hustled on developing materials that helped a lay person understand the importance of F&A. We changed our language, so we don't talk about it as indirect costs or overhead. We talk about it as facilities and administrative costs, which people can have an image of what that is, and we even created infographics giving them images of what that is, so that top graphic is an infographic that shows what part of a building on a university campus is supported by F&A and how that is intricately connected. It is a part of research costs. You can't do research without those items. So we changed our approach, and I think it helped work. Toby mentioned internal discussions on our campuses. That I think is a place where we still have work to do, and so we urge you all to do your part. Let us know if we can be helpful in providing these materials or other materials, and we'd like to be helpful in that regard.
Y'all were exceedingly helpful. I'm from the University of California, and it really made us rethink about how we talk about direct cost on our websites. The visuals were life-changing for me because there really aren't very good visuals out there that talk about indirect costs. So I urge you to continue producing those, and maybe we all can collaborate and continue to produce those, because I think the faculty part of this is still confused. I have a tough time talking to researchers I've known for years to talk about what this is about, and they just say, it's my money. I'm just wondering where this came from. Have we because when Tom Price was talking about it sounded like he didn't understand it. And that was really, I was embarrassed for your boss from NIH. I mean, that was too bad. So, and we did hear from faculty who were like, you go, Tom Price. I mean, there were people who agreed with that point of view. And when we were developing the informed guidance, I know there was pushback from folks about indirect costs as well. So I'm just wondering where it came from, and how do we stay vigilant? And yeah.
So we know in terms of where it came from that there was at least one member from Maryland, Andy Harris, who has been raising questions about indirect costs, had asked for a GAO study on NIH a few years ago, had recently realized that foundations don't pay the same, that the government, the same rate as the government. We, of course, then went into action and, kind of said they pay differently, so you shouldn't compare them. But that was helpful. But I think Andy Harris, if you know, has a relationship with Tom Price. He has a relationship with Nick Mulvaney. So I think that's one source. I also think the budget examiners know where they can go when they need to find money and how they can justify things. They know that indirect costs has always been out there, and I think they probably went to that as, okay, come up with the money, come up with the justification for major cuts, because we've got to cut NIH. The mistake, tactically, from their perspective, but helped us, was that they only went after NIH, and they could have done a much smaller cut across the agencies. It would have been much harder. I don't want to give them any advice, but if I were in their shoes, I wouldn't have proposed a 10% cap on it. That is so deep that even faculty start to understand that's a little bit much. Whereas if they would have proposed a 40%, 45% cap across all agencies, I mean, or in other words, that could have been tougher. Let's hope they don't get smart in next year.
Well, the upside is that the work that folks at your universities have done have laid great groundwork. And so while the sticker shock would not be the same, policymakers, members of Congress recognize that institutions, and a lot of them, when they talk about it in their letter, talk about any cut to F&A would mean that they would not be able to do this work for the federal government. So I think we speculate too that, Toby sort of indicated this, that they kind of backed into this. I don't think that it was exactly what they were going for, but they needed to decrease the non-defense discretionary side so that they could increase the defense discretionary side. NIH is a huge agency, so they grabbed a bunch out of NIH, and then when they had to justify, how are you going to cut our everybody's favorite research agency? They said, oh, we're not going to cut the research, we're only going to cut the F&A. So I do think that some of it was, backing into it. And again, hopefully, and we will stay vigilant, thanks, because that is important, because next year, if the budget does include a smaller much less dramatic cut. And by capping F&A at a lesser rate, but across all agencies, we'll have at least begun those discussions. You cannot do this work without F&A.
And just to be clear, I think we've started to make our case about how critical, how these are all research costs, and that's what we really need to say. And the way we've argued it, there's the research costs that are borne directly by the researchers, and then the ones that are borne by the institutions that support the researchers. And they both, you can't do research without one or the other. And we know we are subsidizing, and Jennifer showed the graph that shows that the amount universities are contributing to research out of their own institutional funds is increasing. So we just need to continue to make that case. I'd also urge, you mentioned the graphic, so that graphic now is available so you can brand it with your own institution, by the way. So we'll get that out here in the next week. The AAMC will really...
The government relations folks will
get it out to them. But the other thing is, creativity from your own campuses. Some of the best graphics and videos can come from you all, so don't let up on that front, because also those are going to have more impact with your folks in your delegations if it's tied to what it means on your campus. But if you get good ones to us, we will make sure other campuses see them and they can replicate them and do them on their own campuses as well. We've got some other graphics that are very well done and specific to individual institutions.
Would you like to go down the list? We've got to get past F&A.
Well, I will say one other, and Toby was right, we spent a lot of time talking about this and talking about it together and talking with others about it together. Something else in how we talk about the research that we do is also necessary to change. And Toby is a real expert in the university federal government partnership, and I've had the opportunity to learn a lot from him about this. Something that, and I was with the University of California for a long time, and I was definitely guilty of this. You get pretty institution proud, and you start talking about our research. This is UC's research. This is, and that begins to make it seem like what we've heard some members of Congress say. Well, we're just subsidizing universities, right? You're just feeding off the trough. We've got to get back to ensuring that as we talk about this, particularly to members of Congress, we talk about the research that University X is conducting for the federal government. This is the federal government's research. We're doing the work, yes, but it is work that the federal government wants done. That's why they fund it in their appropriations bills, and it goes back 70 years. That was one maybe last F&A comment.
Yeah, well, and it's a bigger thing and one thing that I didn't do with you, but I do with all the fellows, is teach them a little bit of history about the policy and the structure and why we came up with that partnership and why it's so unique and why it has made U.S. science head and heels better than any other country. The fact that we use universities through merit review, through competition, it is a free market system. And that's something that, particularly with Republicans, we need to convince them. It gets a little bit worrisome when you go to the Hill and you talk about them in retribution for the fact that we're not letting certain speakers on campus say we need to cut that federal aid to universities. They ain't talking about financial aid, they're talking about research funding. That's something we all need to work on and make sure that we are talking and reminding people why our universities do research. It isn't just to help our faculty to do things that help them. It's to help the American people who benefit from the research that we do. Running through this list real quick, NIH salary cap was proposed. The House did not take it up. I don't think we don't know for sure. We don't think it's in the Senate bill, so you're probably out of the woods. Fetal tissue, you want to say where we are in that, because you know more than I do.
So the House bill would effectively ban future fetal tissue research from fetuses that do not come from, that come from induced abortion. So in effect, those who work in this field know that there's that it is the fetal tissue from induced abortions that is the necessary tissue, the valuable tissue for research. The House language would say no more NIH funding for that research. That actually gets into issues like humanized mice. So it's more than actually the actual work with fetal tissue. It's work that has derived from fetal tissue. So that was a huge concern for us, and every indication was that the Senate was also going to include similar language in their bill. What we have seen, and we haven't been able to get all the bill language yet, but what we understand is in the Senate bill instead is a directive to NIH to conduct a report on the kinds of fetal tissue and what is actually needed for research purposes. And we consider that a huge improvement. We'd rather not have language on that in the bill at all, but it definitely is an improvement from the House language.
So I'll take the next two. On ARPA-E, the House zeroed funding for ARPA-E just like the President did his budget. That was something I'd actually predicted. Wasn't a surprise because the House has typically not been as favorable to ARPA-E, and there are these games that go on where they know that the Senate likes ARPA-E, so they're going to zero it because they want negotiating chips when they're doing the final bill. The Senate did in fact fund ARPA-E. I can't remember what the actual level was, but it wasn't much of a cut. It might have been a slight cut from where we were. It might have been I think it was equal to what it was funded at before. The one area, though, that is just going to be
It's actually an increase.
It's an increase, a slight increase for RP. The one area that's going to be a tough slog is people who care about applied energy, anything in climate change, and you've probably heard the stories that climate change is not mentioned anywhere in the budget. Recently, we've heard that EPA is even rescinding grants that have climate change in the grants. So, and you have people who are trying to protect climate change by saying don't put it in grants, because they want the research to continue and change the terminology. So it's just a tough slog. Those applied energy programs, given they were proposed for some significant cuts by the President, and the Republican House has never been that favorable. The Senate's more favorable, but I think you're going to see cuts ultimately in some of the applied programs and areas, although it is interesting. I think with the hurricanes and things like that, it does really focus some attention on why are we cutting NOAA research by 50%. Maybe that's not a smart thing to do. We'll see. You want to talk about NEA?
Really quickly.
Yep.
So the National Endowments for Humanities and Arts are essentially, in the President's budget request, essentially slated to be zeroed out. There was some funding, but mostly just to close down those agencies. The House bill has restored funding for the endowments, and interestingly, in July, the administration nominated someone to run the National Endowment for the Humanities. So there must be some realization there that agency will not be shut down.
On regulatory reform, I will say this is an area where I invested a lot of time. And we actually made some progress in the 21st Century Cures Act. We got language that looked specifically at some issues, NIH specific, but also called for the creation of a research policy board, as was recommended by the National Academies. And we are waiting. But why we took a little bit of a hiatus was we did not want to, in the midst of arguing against capping FNA, go in and give any justification or rationale that if you cut regulations, that will save enough so now you can justify a cap. And so we've backed away, although those conversations are now going to pick back up again, and particularly getting the Research Policy Board going. So.
On DACA, if you hadn't heard about DACA before this weekend, so the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, this was a program put into effect by executive action in 2012. Pretty interestingly, the current president of the University of California system it was the Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, and Jan Napolitano, implemented this program, which provided essentially amnesty to children who were brought to this country under the age of 16. Clearly not their choice. Many of them came much before the age of 16 and have only known the U.S. as their home. Provided them some amnesty so that they would not be deportation targets, even provided them with the opportunity to work. This was, of course, after rigorous background checks, ensuring that they were not criminals. They had to be enrolled in school or in the military or have a GED. So this is a high bar. We don't have bars like this for all our citizens, but for these DACA kids, we did have a higher bar. And as you likely know, on Tuesday, Secretary Sessions, Attorney General Sessions made an announcement saying that we're going to stop this program. It's unconstitutional because it should not have happened under executive action. I am not going to argue that issue. That's to me, that is not the point. But that it could be a case. However, they did provide a 6-month reprieve so that Congress could act and actually pass a law that makes those immigration changes. That's what we're all going to be spending a lot of time working on over the next 6 months. By the way, the first bill to do this was introduced in 2001. So what hasn't happened in 16 years, we hope now will happen in 6 months. Congress does tend to work a little bit better under a deadline, so we'll see.
So maybe we can get 1 or 2 more questions. I'm just going to say on infrastructure, it's not going to happen this Congress. Tax reform, maybe. There's a lot of things that we would like to see addressed in that context. I won't go into details. Happy to answer questions. I don't know, Jen. Okay. So I guess if there are any questions.
Any last questions? Okay, I've got one. What about changing the name of F&A and indirect costs to something more palatable? Do you have any suggestions? Well, you'll have to come back in January.
No.
It's your assignment.
I'm trying to remember all the suggestions that we have
They're
come
in here
up
somewhere.
Infrastructure.
But that is actually where we start.
Yeah.
And that is, but you can't call it in a bill, or we're not going to. But
Operations.
Operation expenses, things like that. Operating expenses. That was, but we are just talking about it differently. Again, that institutions have costs too, and these are really what pay for those institutional costs. And that the other thing we always say is, Francis Collins did us a favor because in the Senate he was asked, "What do you think percentage-wise NIH spends?" He was asked by Senator Murray, "NIH spends on these types of costs." He said 30%. So that was right where we're at. And we, of course, continue to look for ways to try and draw comparisons to prove that we are not charging anything more than what probably a little bit less than what the government would pay for these costs at their own facilities, their own laboratories, certainly less than when they do federal contracts with industry.
Let's thank our guests for and probably the best thing we can do for everyone's health at this time is to adjourn for the reception, which is just around the corner.